Don't you dare re-sign nothing with this team. Don't sign nothing with this team. You need to get the hell out of there. Go to Canada with Sandy. Get the fuck away from this fucking bum of a coach. Fucking clown. Stephanie White is a bozo, man. She stinks. Look at this. What have you done to be talking to Caitlin Clark? You ain't done nothing, Stephanie White. You a trash-ass coach. Look at this. Crashed out on her, subbed her out. Look, then she throws the clipboard down. Throws the clipboard. Okay. Don't sign no epic deal, Caitlin Clark. Get the fuck out of Indiana. Leave this clown show of an organization.
Women's professional basketball just witnessed something that's never happened before. A franchise player and her head coach didn't just have a disagreement, they had a complete public breakdown on a national stage. The footage is everywhere. Social media is exploding. The locker room is in chaos. But here's what most people are getting wrong. This wasn't about one moment. It wasn't about a clipboard being thrown or harsh words exchanged. What we're actually watching is the collapse of an entire coaching philosophy, caught on camera, with a generational talent watching every second of it. The Indiana Fever didn't just lose a basketball game on Saturday night. They potentially lost their future. And the scariest part? Caitlin Clark has been documenting everything. She's been watching. She's been evaluating. And her next move could change everything about this organization. This is the story nobody's talking about yet. Let's start with what actually happened in Portland, because the footage tells a story that goes way deeper than the surface-level drama. During the game against the Portland Fire, Stephanie White, the head coach of the Indiana Fever, made a substitution decision at exactly 6 minutes and 30 seconds into the first quarter. She benched Caitlin Clark. Now, that by itself wouldn't be remarkable. Coaches make substitutions all the time. But the context here is what makes this explosive. Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement. At that exact moment, the Fever were up 8-2. They were playing with momentum. Clark had 2 points, 3 assists, and a rebound in those opening minutes. The ball was moving. The offense was clicking. Portland's coach saw what was happening and called a timeout. That timeout is basketball language for, we're losing this game if something doesn't change. It's a coach raising a white flag, essentially admitting that Indiana had figured out how to beat them in those first 2.5 minutes. And then White pulled Clark off the floor. What happened next is the part that matters. With Clark on the bench, Portland went on a 13-2 run. The lead vanished. The deficit appeared. The entire momentum of the game flipped upside down, and it never came back. Indiana lost 84-100 to an expansion team, but that's not the real story. The real story is why this substitution happened in the first place. During the post-game press conference, a reporter asked White directly about this decision. Why did you take Clark out when Indiana was playing so well? White's answer changed everything. She said it was their typical substitution pattern. Not a response to what was happening in the game, not a read of the live action. A pattern they'd been running all season. Think about that for a second. She admitted on camera that this substitution wasn't about basketball. It wasn't about strategy or game flow. It was about a script she'd written before the season started. This is where coaching at the highest level gets exposed. In professional basketball, the game is always the primary input. Your plan is secondary. You can have all the strategizing in the world, but if the game is telling you something different in real time, you adjust. You're supposed to override your pre-written plans because the live action is giving you new information. White didn't do that. She stuck to her script even though her franchise player was dominating and her opponent was panicking. The substitution wasn't a coaching decision. It was rotation automation. It was like watching someone follow GPS directions off a cliff because they didn't look up to see the cliff was there. And the 13-2 run that immediately followed was the game film's verdict on that choice. But here's what makes this even worse. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the entire season, there's been a pattern of Clark being pulled out at specific times, regardless of what's actually happening on the court. White mentioned in that same press conference that this timing around 6 to 12 minutes in the first quarter had been their typical substitution pattern all year. That means Caitlin Clark, arguably the most important player on the roster, has been watching herself get benched according to a schedule rather than according to the actual game. Think about what that does to a player's mentality. You're playing great, you're in rhythm, you're leading your team. And then suddenly you're on the bench, not because you did something wrong, but because it's 6:30 and that's when the coach decided this would happen. That's not player development. That's not strategy. That's not coaching. That's a system that's treating a generational talent like a rotation player who needs time management. The Fever didn't just lose a game in Portland. They lost the benefit of their best player's momentum at a critical moment because of a pre-planned schedule. And more importantly, they sent a message to Clark about how much her individual performance actually matters in the decision-making process. The game said one thing, the coach did another. And everyone watching, including Clark, had to decide what that meant about the organization she plays for. The damage from one substitution decision might sound small. But in the context of everything else that happened that night, it became the crack that revealed a much bigger fracture underneath. Now, everyone's talking about the clipboard. It's the visual that went viral. The dramatic moment where Stephanie White, visibly frustrated, threw her clipboard to the ground while standing dangerously close to Caitlin Clark on the sideline. That moment is being framed as an outburst, a loss of professionalism, an angry coach having a meltdown. And sure, all of those things are true. But if you focus only on the clipboard, you're missing what actually happened. This wasn't a random explosion. This was the culmination of White's frustration at a game that was slipping away, combined with the realization that her pre-planned rotation was destroying the game's outcome. She had benched her best player during a moment of momentum, Portland had gone on a run, and now the Fever were losing. The clipboard throw was the physical manifestation of a coaching philosophy collapsing in real time. But here's the thing that nobody's discussing. Sideline physical interactions between coaches and players, especially at the proximity level, documented in that footage, violate professional workplace standards that would be completely unacceptable in literally any other industry. In corporate America, if a supervisor stood that close to an employee, raised their voice, and threw objects while directing verbal criticism at them, there would be HR involvement. There would be documented incidents. There would be consequences. In the WNBA, we're supposed to accept this as normal coaching intensity. We're supposed to see it as passion. We're supposed to treat it as a sign that the coach cares. But let's be honest about what we're actually watching. We're watching a coach lose emotional control while interacting with the franchise's most valuable asset. And we're watching that moment happen on a national stage with cameras rolling. This matters because it's not the first time. Earlier in the season, there was another documented sideline interaction between White and Clark that similarly raised questions about appropriate professional boundaries. That's 2 incidents now. 2 publicly captured moments where the physical and emotional distance between coach and player violated normal professional standards. 1 incident could be an anomaly. 2 incidents start to establish a pattern. The real problem isn't that White threw a clipboard. The real problem is the pattern of decisions that led to that moment. A pre-planned substitution that ignored live game information. A 13-2 run that exposed the futility of that decision. A game slipping away from her control. A realization that her rotation strategy wasn't working. And then an emotional response that manifested on the sideline in front of cameras. This is what happens when coaching philosophy meets reality and reality wins. White came into this season with a system. She had a plan for how to use her players, including specific timing windows for when Clark would be pulled out. But the game was teaching her something different. The game was saying, this plan isn't working. The game was showing her that when Clark is on the floor and playing well, the Fever score. When Clark gets benched according to a schedule, Portland goes on a run. And instead of adapting, instead of adjusting, White doubled down on the plan. She stuck to the rotation she'd designed before the season started, even as the game was proving her wrong in real time. That inflexibility is what broke the system. That inability to read live information and override a pre-written strategy is what caused the breakdown. The clipboard throw is the symptom. The actual disease is a coaching philosophy that prioritizes pre-planned structure over competitive reality. That's what created the environment where a coach would bench a dominant player, watch the game fall apart, and then respond with emotional frustration at the outcome that her own decision produced. Caitlin Clark was watching all of this happen. She was watching her coach's strategy fail. She was watching the game spiral because of decisions that had nothing to do with her performance and everything to do with a rotation template. And she was experiencing, firsthand, what it feels like to play for an organization where the coaching staff's comfort with their pre-written plan matters more than the actual outcome on the floor. That moment on the sideline wasn't just about a clipboard being thrown. It was about a franchise player getting a real-time confirmation of something she'd probably been suspecting all season. Let's break down what the actual game footage reveals, because the numbers tell a completely different story than the narrative White was trying to control in that press conference. The Fever opened with an 8-2 run in the first 2.5 minutes. That's not luck. That's not accident. That's execution. Clark had 2 points, 3 assists, and a rebound in that opening stretch. The ball was moving. The spacing was correct. The offensive rhythm was established. Portland's coach didn't call a timeout because Indiana was playing badly. Portland's coach called a timeout because Indiana was executing at a level that was going to cost them the game if nothing changed. That timeout is critical context. When an opposing coach burns a timeout early in the game, they're essentially admitting defeat in that particular moment. They're saying, we need to interrupt what's happening right now, or we're going to get blown out. It's a red flag signal that the current personnel configuration on the floor is working. It's a competitive data point that any professional coach should be reading in real time. White read it differently. She saw that signal and interpreted it as time to make my scheduled substitution. At 6:30 of the first quarter, she pulled Clark and Boston simultaneously. 2 momentum generators off the floor at the exact moment when Portland was signaling that they couldn't stop the momentum Indiana had established. Analytically, that's not a rotation decision. That's a rotation contradiction. You have information telling you to stay with what's working. You have data saying, keep this lineup on the floor. And you do the opposite because a clock somewhere said it was time. Portland went on a 13-2 run. Indiana's 8-point lead became a 9-point deficit. The game's entire competitive trajectory reversed, and it never came back. That's not coincidence. That's causation. The substitution directly created the outcome that White was then upset about 30 minutes later when she threw the clipboard. But the game film showed more than just that one decision. Look at how Portland scored throughout the game. 52 points in the paint. That's an absurd number. That's not individual player brilliance on Portland's part. That's a systematic failure in Indiana's defensive scheme. And then there's Megan Gustafson. She finished with 22 points on 8 of 8 shooting. Perfect field goal efficiency for an entire game against a professional defensive scheme. That's not a player having a great night. That's a defensive breakdown of massive proportions. Gustafson's normal season average is around 9 points per game. She went from 9 to 22 on perfect shooting. That doesn't happen because she suddenly became a better player. That happens because the defensive assignments and coverage principles that Indiana was running allowed her to get whatever she wanted all game long. She was finding her preferred catch points. She was getting finishing angles that were uncontested. She was operating in a system that wasn't designed to stop her. And whose responsibility is that? The coaching staff. Defensive scheme, coverage assignments, communication about spacing and positioning, that's all on the coaches. When a bench player goes 8-8 against you, it's not about that player having an amazing game. It's about your defense having a terrible game. It's about your coaching staff not adjusting to what they were seeing, not making corrections as the game evolved, not recognizing that their current defensive approach wasn't working against Portland's execution. This is the broader pattern that the film documents across the entire season. Rotation decisions that contradict immediate outcomes. Defensive schemes that aren't adapting to what opponents are doing. Strategic plans that are being executed regardless of what the live game is communicating. It's a system that's married to its own structure instead of being responsive to competitive reality. Clark is watching this game film the same way everyone else is. She's seeing the same 13-2 run. She's noticing the same defensive breakdowns. She's reading the same stats about Gustafson's shooting percentage. She's experiencing the same outcome, a loss to an expansion team that resulted from decisions she had no control over. And unlike most players, she understands exactly what that means about her organization's competence. She's been doing this long enough to read the analytics. She knows basketball well enough to identify the coaching failures. And she knows her own value well enough to understand that these failures aren't her responsibility to fix. They're the organization's responsibility to correct. After the game, Caitlin Clark sat down for her post-game interview. She was asked about the officiating, about whether the refs had impacted Indiana's ability to play. This is where things get really interesting, because her response wasn't what anyone expected, and it definitely wasn't what the organization wanted to hear. She said, "Officiating wasn't my problem tonight." Now, on the surface, that's a simple statement, but you need to understand the context to understand why this statement is actually the most significant communication Clark has produced all season. She fouled out. She had 5 personal fouls in a road loss to an expansion team. The completely normal, expected, professional response to that situation, the response every athlete is trained to give, is to reference the foul trouble as a competitive factor. It's the standard deflection. It's the safe answer. It's what you say when you want to avoid blaming your coach, your teammates, or your organization on a public platform. You blame the refs. You say the officiating was tight. You reference foul trouble. You move on. Nobody gets offended. The organization doesn't have to address anything uncomfortable. Clark didn't do that. She explicitly stated that the refs were not her problem. And in the specific context of everything that had happened before and during that game, the clipboard footage, the 6-30 substitution, the 13-2 run, the loss to Portland, that statement becomes something completely different. It's not a neutral observation about referees. It's a precisely constructed public communication from a player who understands that every word she says at a post-game podium is analyzed by every stakeholder in her professional situation. Think about what she was doing. She's identifying what her problem wasn't, and she's leaving what her problem actually was for everyone else to conclude from the documented context. She's not being subtle. She's not being accidental. She's being strategic. She's communicating something very specific to a very specific audience: the Indiana Fever ownership, the front office, the coaching staff, and the league. What she's saying is, I know what happened out there. I watched the same game you watched. I saw the substitution at 6:30 when we were playing well. I saw the 13-2 run. I saw the defensive breakdowns. I saw the clipboard being thrown on the sideline. I watched all of it, and I know exactly where the accountability lies. And it's not with the referees. That's a player communicating that she's been documenting everything, that she's evaluating the organization, that she's tracking the failures and the decisions and the patterns, that she's not going to accept the easy excuse, and that she's making note of all of it for whatever decision she has to make next. This is important because Clark has a contract situation looming. She hasn't signed an extension. She's being asked to commit her professional future to the Indiana Fever, and she's actively evaluating whether this organization is worth that commitment. Her post-game statement is part of that evaluation. It's part of the record she's building. What makes this communication so significant is what a professional athlete is actually signaling when they refuse to blame the refs. They're signaling that the refs aren't the problem. They're signaling that there are other problems, bigger problems, more fundamental problems with how the organization is being run. They're signaling, without saying it directly, that those problems are the ones that matter. And she's doing this on camera at a post-game podium with full knowledge that it will be clipped and shared and analyzed. She's not hiding. She's not being ambiguous. She's leaving a documented record of her thinking. She's saying, publicly, that she understands what happened and why it happened and where the responsibility lies. Every stakeholder watching that post-game interview understood what she was communicating. The coaching staff understood. The front office understood. The ownership understood. The media understood. She wasn't being cryptic. She was being precise. She was selecting her words with the kind of deliberation that only comes from someone who knows exactly what she's saying and exactly who she's saying it to. This is the kind of communication that precedes a significant decision. This is a player documenting her evaluation. This is a franchise player signaling that she's been watching, she's been tracking the failures, and she's making note of what she's seen as she decides whether to commit her future to this organization. Now let's talk about what the Indiana Fever organization actually has on the table in front of them, because it's more serious than most people realize. The documented record this season includes several pieces of evidence that collectively paint a picture of organizational dysfunction. First, there's the formal WNBA warning for reporting violations. That means the league had to officially tell the Fever that they were violating league protocols in how they were documenting or reporting information. That's not a small thing. That's the league-level equivalent of a parent telling a child they're doing something wrong and they need to stop immediately. Then there are the league disciplinary actions. 2 of them in a single week. That's not a pattern. That's a crisis. That's an organization receiving official warnings about multiple violations in rapid succession. That's the league essentially saying, we're keeping our eye on you because something is wrong. Then, there's the documented pattern of rotation decisions that have been analytically contradicted by immediate game outcomes. The 6:30 substitution is the most visible example, but it's not the only one. Throughout the season, there have been rotation choices that didn't make sense analytically, that weren't responsive to game information, that seemed to follow a pre-written template regardless of what was actually happening on the floor. Then, there's the press conference responses from White, where she's locating accountability in collective language rather than individual ownership. She's saying things like our typical substitution pattern, and that's been how we've been doing things, instead of saying, I made that decision and here's why. She's distributing responsibility across the organization instead of owning her decisions. That's a coaching staff that's not taking individual accountability for the outcomes they're producing. Then there's the sideline footage. Not just from Saturday night, but from earlier in the season too. Twice now, there's been documented footage of physically inappropriate interactions between White and Clark. That's a pattern. That's the organization allowing a coaching environment where a franchise player is being subjected to sideline interactions that would be completely unacceptable in any other professional context. And then, there's Clark's post-game statement, the most recent piece of evidence. The clearest public signal she's produced this season about the state of her relationship with the coaching staff. All of this is time-sensitive because of one crucial factor, Clark's contract situation. She hasn't committed to an extension. She's actively evaluating whether to dedicate her professional future to the Indiana Fever. That evaluation is happening right now, in real time, as the season is being played out. Her public communications across this entire season have been careful. They've been precise. In press conferences, she's been conditionally positive about the team's direction. She's given safe answers when she could have been more critical. She's held back. But that post-game statement in Portland, that was different. That was her signaling that she stopped holding back, that she's documenting everything, that she's watching. And here's the thing that the front office needs to understand. Clark is watching the same game film as everyone else. She's reading the same patterns. She's seeing the same substitution decisions that don't make sense. She's noticing the same defensive breakdowns. She's observing the same lack of coaching accountability. But unlike fans or media, she's experiencing it from the inside. She's living in it every single day. She's the person most directly affected by these decisions. The front office's accountability window is defined by her evaluation timeline, not by the regular season schedule. Those two things are not the same. The regular season has 50 games and a predictable schedule. Clark's decision about her future could come at any moment. It could come after the next loss. It could come after another rotation decision that doesn't make sense. It could come tomorrow or next week or next month. But it's coming, and when it comes, the organization won't get to control the timing. The cost of fixing this situation right now is measurable. It's real. It involves making difficult decisions about White's future with the organization. It involves acknowledging that the hiring decision to put her in charge wasn't successful. It involves the reputational cost of admitting a mistake. But that cost, applied right now, in the immediate term, is lower than the alternative. The alternative is Caitlin Clark's evaluation, concluding that the environment around her isn't correctable within the Indiana Fever organization. The alternative is her deciding that committing her professional future to this team would be a mistake. The alternative is her making a decision that affects the franchise for potentially a decade or more. That cost is infinitely higher. The organization is running out of time. Every game that's played is another piece of evidence going into Clark's evaluation file. Every rotation decision, every coaching staff interaction, every loss to an expansion team, it's all being documented and analyzed. And her next major public communication might not be a post-game interview where she's being careful with her words. It might be a contract decision that answers the question that the entire organization should be focused on right now. Does Caitlin Clark believe the Indiana Fever can build a winning program around her, or does she need to look elsewhere? Let's zoom out for a second and talk about something that's bigger than just this one game or this one substitution decision. Let's talk about what White's rotation philosophy actually reveals about her approach to player development, because that's crucial context for understanding why this situation has deteriorated so much. In her post-game press conference, White referenced Raven Johnson, the Fever's other point guard. She mentioned that Johnson is in a minute restriction. That's normal for a developing young player who's still getting acclimated to the professional level. But here's what White said about why Johnson wasn't on the floor in certain situations. We didn't want to run her in that environment without another ball handler on the floor. She was talking about a tough road game in Golden State, a hostile environment where the opposing crowd is loud and the defensive pressure is intense. Now, let's think about what that statement actually reveals. White is saying that she withholds developing players from difficult environments because she doesn't want them to have to manage those environments without additional support. She's protecting them from discomfort. She's sheltering them from pressure. She's limiting their exposure to the competitive scenarios that would actually force them to grow. That's not a development philosophy. That's a protection philosophy. And those two things are fundamentally different. Player development in professional basketball requires exposure to escalating levels of difficulty. A young player needs to learn how to handle pressure situations, how to operate in hostile environments, how to maintain composure when things are loud and chaotic and difficult. You don't develop players by protecting them from those scenarios. You develop them by putting them in those scenarios and trusting them to figure it out. What White is describing is a coaching approach that limits a player's growth ceiling to match the coach's risk tolerance. Johnson was drafted to develop into a professional-level contributor. But if she's being withheld from difficult environments, if she's being sheltered from pressure situations, if she's being protected rather than challenged, then her development is being artificially capped. Her ceiling isn't determined by her potential. It's determined by White's comfort level with putting her in uncomfortable situations. That philosophy extends to how White is using Clark as well. Yes, Clark is a much more developed player. She's already proven she can handle professional competition at the highest level. But the same philosophy is at work. Pre-planned substitution patterns, scripted rotations, decisions that follow a template rather than responding to live game information. It's the same protective framework, just applied at a different level. The Fever's entire system seems to prioritize the coach's comfort with structure over the player's growth through challenge. That's backwards. That's not how you build a winning program around a generational talent. That's how you build a program where the most talented player gets frustrated because the coaching staff is limiting her ability to impact the game based on a rotation schedule that has nothing to do with basketball. This matters because it tells us something important about whether White is actually the right person to build a winning program around Clark. Winning in professional basketball requires players who are adaptable, who can make in-game adjustments, who can thrive in pressure situations, who understand their role and can execute it at a high level. You develop those players through challenge, through exposure to difficult scenarios, through trust that they can figure it out. White's philosophy seems to be built on the opposite principle. It's built on predetermined plans, on consistency of structure regardless of circumstances, on protection from discomfort. Those things can create stability in the short term, but they don't create winning in the long term. They create predictable, rigid, inflexible organizations that can't adjust when the game requires adjustment. That's exactly what we saw on Saturday night. Portland called a timeout. The situation changed. Live game information contradicted the pre-written plan, and instead of adjusting, White stuck to the plan. That inflexibility isn't a coaching style choice. It's a competitive failure. It's an inability to do the one thing professional basketball at the highest level demands: read the game and adjust accordingly. For a player like Clark, who is intellectually engaged with basketball, who understands analytics, who can see the game at a sophisticated level, playing for a coach with that philosophy has to be frustrating. She can see what's happening. She can identify what should be happening, but she's playing for a system that doesn't prioritize her observations or her performance in the moment. It prioritizes the predetermined structure. That disconnect is what the whole situation with White represents. Not just bad coaching decisions, but a fundamentally misaligned approach to what winning basketball requires. Clark is a generational talent. She needs a coach who can read the game, who trusts her, who adjusts the system around her performance, not despite it. What she has instead is a coach with a protection philosophy and a predetermined rotation template. The longer that mismatch continues, the worse it gets for everyone involved. Here's the reality that the Indiana Fever ownership, the Simon family, and the front office need to understand. Their timeline for making a decision about Stephanie White's future is not controlled by them. It's controlled by Caitlin Clark, and that timeline is closing much faster than a regular season schedule would suggest. The documented record this season is now complete enough to evaluate without projection or speculation. We have concrete evidence. We have game film. We have press conference statements. We have officiating data. We have a formal WNBA warning. We have multiple league disciplinary actions. We have sideline footage. We have Clark's post-game statement. We have everything we need to understand what's working and what's broken. What's broken is the coaching staff's decision-making process. What's broken is the rotation philosophy. What's broken is the defensive scheme execution. What's broken is the approach to player development. What's broken is the organizational communication structure. These aren't small things. These aren't things that can be corrected by minor adjustments or mid-season tweaks. These are fundamental issues with how the organization is being run. The ownership group made a decision to hire Stephanie White because they wanted her to do something she had never done before at the professional level: build and manage a winning program around a generational talent. That's not an assistant coach job. That's a head coach job. That's a different category of responsibility. And the 2024 season record is the evidence against which that hiring decision must now be evaluated. The losses to Portland. Twice. The first quarter substitution decisions that contradict game film. The defensive breakdowns that allowed bench players to shoot perfect percentages. The league disciplinary actions. The formal WNBA warning. The sideline interactions that violated professional workplace standards. All of that is evidence. All of that is data. And all of that points in the same direction. But here's where the timeline becomes crucial. The ownership doesn't get to decide when they want to make a change. That decision is being made for them by someone else. Clark is evaluating her situation. She's watching the same game film. She's reading the same news articles about league warnings and disciplinary actions. She's seeing the same sideline footage. She's experiencing the same rotation decisions that don't make sense analytically. And she's deciding whether she wants to commit her professional future to an organization that operates this way. That decision could come at any moment. It could come after the next loss. It could come after another confusing substitution decision. It could come right now, today. Ownership doesn't get to control when she makes that decision. They don't get to say, we'll address the coaching situation in the offseason. Because if Clark makes her decision before the offseason arrives, before they've had a chance to do anything about White, then they've lost. They've lost far more than just a coach. They've lost the franchise player. They've lost the next decade of basketball. They've lost the competitive window that only comes once in an organization's history. That's the cost of waiting. That's the cost of hoping the season improves and everything gets resolved naturally. It won't. The organizational forcing function here is Clark's contract situation. She hasn't committed to an extension. That extension is the question that everything else is subordinate to. Until that's resolved, until she commits to the organization's future, nothing else matters. Not the regular season record, not the playoff seeding, not the conference standings. The only thing that matters is whether Clark is going to sign that extension. And she's not going to sign it while Stephanie White is the head coach making the decisions that have created this situation. The ownership group's accountability window is defined by her evaluation timeline. Those two things are not synchronized right now. They're not moving at the same pace. The regular season will have 50 games, and it will take months to play them all. But Clark's decision about her future could come much faster than that. It could come before half the season is played. It could come when the organization least expects it. The cost of acknowledging that White hasn't worked out, that the hiring decision didn't produce the required returns, is real. There's reputational cost. There's the embarrassment of admitting a mistake to the fans and the league. There's financial obligations and contractual complications. But that cost, applied right now in the immediate term, is lower than the alternative. The alternative is watching Caitlin Clark evaluate her situation, come to a conclusion, and then make a decision that changes the franchise's trajectory for years. That cost is not measurable. That's the cost you can't quantify. That's the cost that keeps ownership groups up at night. The Atlanta Dream game is coming next. The documented record will continue to build from that point forward. Every game that's played is adding more evidence to Clark's evaluation file. Every coaching decision is being analyzed. Every rotation choice is being noted. And with every piece of new evidence that gets added to that file, the window for ownership to correct course gets smaller. The timeline isn't expanding. It's contracting. What started as a sideline confrontation and a confusing substitution decision has become the organizational question that defines the Indiana Fever's entire future. Caitlin Clark isn't just evaluating a coaching staff. She's evaluating whether an organization can commit to winning at the highest level while making her a priority. The game film shows the answers. The press conferences document the philosophy. The league disciplinary actions prove the dysfunction. The ownership group has a choice to make, and it has to be made soon. Not because the regular season demands it, but because Clark's timeline demands it. Every game without a change is another piece of evidence going into her decision file. Every confusing substitution, every defensive breakdown, every failure to adjust is another reason for her to look elsewhere. This isn't just about basketball anymore. This is about whether an organization can recognize what they have, commit to protecting it, and do the difficult work of fixing what's broken before it's too late. The gap between their timeline and hers is closing. And the cost of waiting is becoming exponentially higher with each passing day. Subscribe for the full analysis as this situation develops.